see and hear me, I suppose.
Yes, I can.
Okay, good, good. Yeah.
Welcome to the webinar session of Department of Development Communication Extension and Journalism Institute of Home Economics, University of Delhi. This is a webinar series and our today's topic is Social Movements and New Media Lessons from Bhopal. Social movements primarily take the form of non-institutionalized collective political action which strive for political or we can say social change. While India has witnessed many such movements over the centuries, the concept of social movements gained currency in new media very recently. So today we have with us Dr. Pawas Bisht, lecturer in media culture and creative practice at the School of Humanities, Keele University, UK. In his works as a researcher and documentary filmmaker, he examines the intersections of media, memory, and politics at both individual and collective levels. His ethnographic research and social movements and memory work in relation to the Bhopal gas disaster has been published in leading journals. Today, he has taken out time for the webinar to share his knowledge on the topic. I welcome you, Pawas, and thank you very much for this time. And over to you now.
Thank you, Yuki. I'm very happy to be joining you from Nottingham, my home. Thank you really to Yuki for this opportunity. I was meant to be in India towards the end of March, and in April, New Delhi is my home city. Yuki and I studied together at the Mass Communication Research Center. And it was a great disappointment to me to not be able to travel because of the lockdown. So when Yuki contacted me to about this opportunity of speaking to you, I was really delighted, and I'm so happy to be sharing some of my research with you. This is such an important subject. Yuki has already stressed some of the significance of this issue in her introduction. And I also really liked the whoever wrote that introduction on the Facebook page post was also absolutely on the mark. This relationship between social movements and news media is so significant. It's significant for social movements in terms of their external publics, because really to achieve their aims, to effect the political and social changes that they're seeking to effect, they need to reach out to the wider publics, and they need to be able to put pressure on the political actors and on the actors that hold actual political power. And secondly, in relation to the internal audience, recognition in mainstream news media is extremely significant in terms of, gaining a sense of recognition. The supporters of the social movement begin to feel that, yes, the movement wields power, that there is a certain legitimacy in terms of the issues that they are campaigning for. So absolutely, this relationship between social movements and news media, and the ability of social movements to gain representation within news media is absolutely vital. This is also a very important time to be speaking about this issue, because I think, and we can talk about this in the question and answer session afterwards. I think we are in a difficult moment politically. We're seeing this across the world. I think democratic processes are being really challenged and questioned. We have majoritarian, totalitarian governments, or governments leaning towards those tendencies in many countries across the world, in Europe, in Latin America, in the US, of course, most famously, also in India. So social movements are key political actors that are really trying to challenge some of these tendencies that we're seeing within our political systems and our media systems. And they're really, I think, key actors for maintaining the health of our democratic system. So I think this is a really important moment also to be talking about this issue now. Bhopal is something that I have been working on for a really long time. I first became aware of the movement in Bhopal when I was an undergraduate student. Like you, I studied a BA degree in English literature at Hindu College, and it was from one of my lecturers there that I had this first introduction with the movement in Bhopal. So that was, way back in 2001. So it really has been an engagement of almost 2 decades. I started my PhD work on Bhopal in 2009. And I did that at Loughborough University in the UK. So I moved away to the UK to start this PhD, and I completed that PhD in 2013. The presentation that I'm sharing with you actually draws on a lot of the research work that I did then for the PhD, but it is also drawing on my subsequent engagement, with the movement. So it's really a long-term engagement with this specific social movement. Okay, so let's get started. Hopefully this will work. Right. So, I've already established the need for social movements to seek representation in news media, especially mainstream news media. But actually, it is really, really difficult for social movements, especially movements that we might label as radical social movements, to access media, to secure the space within mainstream news media. Now, radical is often used as a label to delegitimize social movements. You often hear this label being used, often by mainstream news media, as a negative label to suggest that there is something extreme about certain social movements. I am using this label actually as a positive label, as a critical label, to identify movements that are really seeking to challenge dominant and established ideologies. These can be ideologies that are linked to established economic ideas like neoliberal development. So all movements that are linked to anti-capitalism, environmentalism, a lot of these movements are challenging established ideas of what constitutes development. So if you look at the picture on the left-hand side of your screen, this is from the protest in 2012-13 against a nuclear plant. This is from the state of Tamil Nadu, Kudankulam. And so this is an anti-nuclear protest, a long-running movement from people who were worried about, not being included in the discussions around the safety of their coastal communities, worried about effects on their livelihoods, from this large nuclear facility that was really sited on their doorstep. And this movement, again, really struggled to get any news representation. A more recent example is one on the right-hand side of your screen. You see this is a forest rights rally. This is actually from one of their actions at Jantar Mantar. And you see, this is, again, a coalition of different social movements, many representing, Adivasis, indigenous people from different states in India that are demanding the proper implementation of the Forest Rights Act to protect their access to traditional lands upon which their ways of life and livelihoods depend. And again, a movement like this, struggles to get representation within the mainstream news media. They struggle because they are representing people who are disempowered. These are movements who traditionally do not have the kind of media access, and the aims and ideas and stories that they're trying to tell do not fit in with the established narratives and frames in mainstream media. These are often labeled as anti-development social movements. Okay, even if a social movement enters news representation, very often the frames that get attached to it are completely negative. So here is an example on your screens now of the very recent protests, ongoing protests in the US at the moment. I'm sure you're all aware of it. George Floyd, a Black American man, was killed by a white policeman. Another example of systemic racism in the US. Movements like Black Lives Matter, other civil rights movements are now on the streets protesting against this very recent killing. And here is Fox News completely removing attention from those systemic issues, very real systemic issues around structural racism, and instead labeling these protesters as a mob and focusing only on the aspect of rioting. So you see this kind of very negative framing that protest often acquires, and movements often acquire. An example from closer home, this is a coverage from 2018. Some of you might remember this. We had a violent attack on Dalit community, which was celebrating, marking a key event in Bhima Koregaon. And after that violent attack, there were protests in several cities. And here is the Times of India again. Look at the label of mobs. We see that label being used again to focus on protests and movements as something entirely negative, as something entirely disruptive. So this is just to illustrate the challenge that social movements are facing. That one, they don't get media representation. Second, when they do get media representation, when they enter the news cycle, they are often being attached with only this kind of disruptive framing and negative framing. So in this context, what can we learn from Bhopal? Bhopal is certainly an example of a movement that has grappled creatively with some of these challenges over a long period of time. I'm quite aware that most of the students on this call, were born after the year 2000. So for you, the Bhopal gas disaster really is something, in deep history. I will give you some context for this, and I will explain to you, what has happened over the 35 years of this movement. But I'm sure many of you encountered at least some mention of this disaster in the very recent coverage of, this very unfortunate gas leak in Vizag, which was really like a reenacting of the Bhopal tragedy. So these are some pictures from that recent coverage. I will again talk about this connection a little bit later in my presentation. So just to remind you and set the scene for what happened in Bhopal, what is the context for the social movement there, some background information. The gas leak in Bhopal happened from a pesticide factory in the city of Bhopal. The factory was run by Union Carbide Limited. This was an Indian subsidiary of a large American chemicals corporation. The leak happened on the night of 2nd December, early morning of 3rd December. And it was a horrific disaster. 8 to 12,000 people died in their sleep, on that same night. Subsequently, figures vary between 25 died from injuries that were sustained in that initial leak. Several 100,000 more continue to suffer from chronic illnesses that are linked to this gas exposure. It was an incredible event. I have this picture from the Time magazine, which is giving you a sense of how significant this was globally. An American company was involved, the scale of the suffering and the death. So it was really, media coverage was across global news outlets. This was really, really significant. However, what subsequently happened is a complete forgetting. The Indian government wanted to quickly move on at that time, and subsequently, the Indian government, like many other governments across the world, has been following a policy of neoliberal capitalism, dependent upon flows of international money, corporate money. So a narrative about a transnational corporation not doing the right thing was not a narrative that they wanted to remember. So it was very logical that they tried to suppress it. Also, the fact that they were not able to protect their own public and ensure their safety was not a narrative that they wanted to remember. The corporation, of course, did not want to remember because it wanted to carry on with its work of making profit. So a financial settlement was reached between these two main actors in 1989, and their attempt was to completely settle the disaster and say, okay, it's been fixed, everything's been fixed, all the injuries have been fixed, let's move on. What was not acknowledged in all of this was the fact that people continued to suffer, that there wasn't ever a real understanding of the long-term nature of the injuries that people had sustained. What was also not recognized in this settlement and subsequently by both the state and the companies involved was that there was a second disaster that began to happen, had already been happening since the factory had been set up, which was a disaster linked to the contamination of the underground water around the factory site. This contamination had already started when the factory was in operation. It continued after the gas leak because the factory was abandoned, wasn't cleaned up properly. So now we have a site of several kilometers radius around the factory site where several 100,000 poor, very poor people live, where the groundwater is entirely contaminated, where the soil is contaminated, and people, for want of any other clean supply of water, have been drinking this groundwater. And so you have now a whole new population of victims. Many of these are children who are now being born with various deformities. So it's a completely new set of injuries and new victims. So you see, Bhopal is an ongoing environmental disaster. The injuries from the first leak continue, but we also have these new set of injuries. So the social movement in Bhopal is campaigning for justice for these injuries, the old continuing injuries and these new injuries from the water contamination. What's been happening in terms of the news reporting? The news reporting, unfortunately, has not been able to keep up. The news coverage has been very episodic. Largely, the news coverage is limited to the anniversary of the disaster, or when some new report comes out or something like that. It is very often lacking context. They are not able to trace the history of the disaster. They're not able to trace the connections to corporate actors, to corporations. So it's very, very limited. And it is in this context that the social movement had to really intervene to make visible all of these missing connections, to restore to Bhopal that global significance. Let me just show you at this point some examples of some of this episodic coverage, just to give you some sense of this. So if this will allow me to do that, second. Right. So just to give you a sense of the kind of coverage that we get. So this is just from Google News. I was just looking at what was the anniversary coverage around this anniversary, and you can see this is the top story from NDTV. It's a commemorative story. Just very quickly looking at what is the nature of what's the framing, what is the story that they're trying to tell, and if you see. It says, lest we forget Bhopal gas tragedy that choked thousands to death in 1984. From that headline, again, it's apparent that the focus is entirely on that gas leak, on the event of the gas leak back then, 35 years ago. From the very headline, you can tell that they are not emphasizing the continuing nature of the injury and the current disaster of the water contamination. I mean, if you go on to read more of this, you will see that it's largely focused on the past. There is some mention of current injuries, but there is no real mentioning, no mentioning at all of the issue of water contamination. And then it ends very simply by looking at some social media, tweets that went out on the anniversary. So an example, perfect example of this kind of episodic coverage. It's the anniversary. Let's do a story. The story is entirely focused on the past. They pick some Twitter tweets, and that's it. And this is ndtv.com, one of our supposedly quality news outlets. So you're seeing the problem that I'm trying to illustrate. Having said that, not everything is. It doesn't mean that other frames don't exist. And just as an example of another news outlet, NewsClick, which is one of the newer digital startups, news platforms, chooses to lead with the contaminated groundwater framing, and chooses to give voice to the victims. Actually, this is a story that really takes on that frame of the continuing disaster. If you read more of this, you can see that they're illustrating here the infected, the communities that are affected by the water contamination. And you also have quotes later on in here from groups such as the Bhopal Group for Information and Action that are a key part of the campaign for justice in Bhopal. So we are seeing, these are two stories that are illustrating for you, one, the problem of the episodic reactive coverage that is the dominant trend, but I'm also showing you how through the work of the social movements, this other frame is present. One very final example, just to show the current news frames. This is the story from the Hindustan Times about the Vizag gas leak, and you can see them making the connection to the Bhopal gas tragedy, so that's important. What is heartening about this story is that towards the end of the story, the last paragraph actually mentions the ongoing water contamination in Bhopal. So again, an example of how the movement has been successful to ensure that this narrative of the second disaster, is being picked up in news media. So let me just return to the PowerPoint. So that was just a quick example of what was just some of the current coverage. To give you a little bit more context on what is the social movement that I'm talking about. So this is a group called the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal. It's a coalition of survivors organizations based in Bhopal. So these are made up of the survivors from the gas leak, but also some people who are now from the water affected communities. But they are supported by long-term middle-class activists, educated, media savvy, who have been supporting the movement for a really long time. And they also have international allies based in countries such as the UK and the US. The movement's aim is to really, shift the focus away from this kind of just to focus on the past, to emphasize the current global environmental disaster. Their aim is to really shift attention to this idea of the second disaster, the water contamination, new injuries. This is significant for them because it restores focus on the responsibility, the continuing responsibility of the government, but also of the American corporations, Union Carbide and Union Carbide's new owner, Dow Chemicals. Now, how are they able to do this? What strategies are they employing to make sure that outlets such as the Hindustan Times do mention this narrative of the water contamination? They're able to do this, and their ability to do this is dependent to a large degree on new resources, opportunities, and networks that emerged around the turn of the millennium, towards the late 1990s, early 2000s, when digital communications technologies, ICT, became affordable and arrived in India in an accessible way. It is at that point that they established the Bhopal.net website, which is the key platform for some of the media strategies. I'll show you the website and we'll look at it, what they're doing with it in some detail. But before we go there, I want to just lay out a theoretical, a conceptual bit of framework for you. Because you're students of journalism, I think it's important for me to bring in some theoretical frameworks that you might find useful in understanding, how media systems are operating. So this is the work of a scholar called Andrew Chadwick. You might be aware of his work. So in a very important text in 2013, he writes about the hybrid media system. Now, what Chadwick basically is arguing is that we should be a little bit wary about this idea that somehow digital technology is a straightforward way for traditionally disempowered actors like social movements or for the general public to bypass the mainstream media and somehow exercise power. He says that that's too simple. It's too simple. This idea that digital somehow allows you to go around mainstream media, and now you've got this new technology and you can do everything. Everything's fine. He instead argues that we need to think about this in a more complex way. Current media systems are not a simple replacement of the old traditional news media with new media, even though new media would like to tell you that story about itself. But actually what we see is that they exist alongside each other, and there are very interesting interconnections between newer media platforms and the older existing traditional platforms. And actually, the actors who are really powerful are the ones who are able to move between these new and old systems. So this is what is very interesting about his approach and his idea that actually what is interesting, actually what is powerful in this current system is hybrid mobilizations. So a key idea that he advances is that the internet is allowing activists and social movements to catch up with the 24-hour news cycle and respond with speed to emerging news agendas. So what he's basically saying is that digital technologies are being used not to bypass traditional media, but to actually ensure that you're getting represented, that you can guide the frames and how stories are being told in the traditional media, in the mainstream media. So keep this in mind, and I will show you examples of how this is happening in relation to Bhopal. So let's just now have a look at the website, and I can show you some examples of how this happens. Stop sharing. I'm sorry that this switching is a bit cumbersome. Yeah. So this is the website for the campaign, and I would really encourage you to explore the website and on your own to follow up on the analysis that very quick analysis that I'm doing now. But you will discover that the website is completely oriented to the media logics, of the mainstream, of mainstream journalism. So it's completely oriented to the needs of journalists. And it's completely driven by a desire to ensure that its narratives get picked up and moved into the domain of mainstream media. So if you look at the first way in which it does this is if you look at the key sections. Aside from this section on the curative petition, which is something to do with the legal case that's still going on in relation to Bhopal, the other three key tabs are all media related. So we have a For the Media tab, we have a Recent News tab, which again contains press releases, statements, newsletters. We have something for Hindi journalists. So you again have here press releases. The whole format in which they are presenting the news is actually entirely in the form of press releases. So this is the landing page. Now, let's look at this first post on this landing page. Shocking news of the gassing of thousands in Vizag rends our hearts, but it fails to surprise us. This is a press release, and again, remember the point I was making about, and that Chadwick was highlighting, that this is about being very agile and responding to events that are happening and to make connections with them so that you can enter news representation. So you can see, as soon as something like that happened there, the movement in Bhopal responds immediately, drafts a press release, makes that connection between what happened in Bhopal, what happened in Vizag. If you read the press note, it will really say, that lessons were not learned from Bhopal. You can see the headline is already indicating that. And it's again telling the story of how, what needs to be done, this kind of the ensuring that corporations are responsible and that the state takes care of its people. You can see that there are press releases linked to COVID. So again, extremely important. When Trump visited just before we entered lockdown in India, you can see that they put out a press release protesting against Trump's visit, because of course the companies involved in the Bhopal disaster are American. You can see that everything, all the press statements are framed as complete news reports. So you can, if you're a journalist, choose to just copy and paste this into your website, into your publication, and they're deliberately designed, in this way to ensure that there is that kind of reproduction. We know news cycles demand speed. News organizations are working with very limited staff, especially some of the online news organizations. So this is designed to respond to that need. And I've seen in my own research, many instances where straight verbatim reproduction of press releases is happening. So this is working as a strategy. So what we're seeing is really, a website that is catering to the needs of, journalists and journalists' practices. Another very important section that I would like to show you as part of this website is in the For the Media tab, they have an information section. And this is really remarkable, because what they have here in a very accessible format is the entire information that you would need, the key information that you would need to write a story that is thematic, that allows you to provide a history to what you're reporting on, that allows you to make connections between the past, the present, and the future. So, so they are attempting to ensure that journalists have information at hand which allows them to write a thematic story, that allows them to write a story that has that historic context, that has the kind of understanding of thematic issues. So you can see, what are our demands? What is the history of, this movement? What is the timeline? They're giving you all of that information. So it's really showing you how they are, through a digital platform like their own website, attempting to ensure and guide mainstream news representation in a particular direction, which is more in line with their own aims. So just returning to, hopefully that's given you some sense of, how this is working. So just returning to the PowerPoint presentation again. Right. So just summarizing. So, so they are using the website to explicitly address the requirements of the local and national media. They're making press releases available in Hindi and English. These are complete news stories allowing for speed, verbatim reproduction. Now that we just saw, you had the Vizag story, you had the stories around COVID, you had the Trump story. The timing, content, and framing of the press releases and press conferences is carefully aligned to the shifting agendas of local and national news. And what it's also doing is it very effectively exploits the very predictable pattern of anniversary journalism. So they know that around each anniversary, there is going to be some coverage. So they make sure that around that anniversary, they're having multiple events, multiple press conferences, releasing key reports that ensures that the issue of the continuing contamination, the continuing liability of the corporations remains in the news coverage. Okay, so we're moving towards the final part of the presentation. I want to say a little bit about, how the movement has also been successful in accessing other national media systems and other global news platforms, like the BBC, for instance, and how this in turn has been very effective in getting national media to take on some of the frames that they would like to be adopted. So I'm focusing on the 2012 London Olympics. Again, this is also an event that is in the distant past for many of you. Some of you might remember some of it. But let me just give you a quick breakdown of what happened. Dow Chemicals was a key sponsor for the Olympics in London, the 2012 Olympics in London. It was one of the sustainability partners of the London Olympic. It is completely ironic. We might laugh about it, that a company that has a history of environmental contamination is chosen as the sustainability partner of a large global event. But we know that greenwashing corporations are very effective in using some of the CSR initiatives. They have big budgets in PR to precisely do that, to precisely make sure that the public narrative around the corporation at least appears to be green. So this was part of that attempt. When the people in Bhopal realized that Dow was who's the company owning Union Carbide is a key sponsor for this large global event, they immediately started a campaign to get Dow removed as the sponsor. And they also put pressure on the Indian government to say that they will not send a team to the Olympics, to the 2012 Olympics. Now, their efforts at forcing the government to, issue some kind of statement or to stop the team from going were not proving to be very effective. At this stage, they were very effective in getting their UK allies to access the UK news media. So what happened is some of their local supporters in the UK managed to get local politicians, so some people who were part of the London Assembly. And I have this picture here, so the picture on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is a picture from one of the most famous, news programs. It's called Newsnight. It goes out on BBC. It's a key news show. And the woman you see in your picture is Meredith Alexander. She was part of a commission that looked after the sustainability aspects of the London Olympics. So the movement in Bhopal was able to gain the support of a key spokesperson like her. And she went on air on this program and resigned publicly on this news program. So this was a live resignation. And it completely captured the news cycle in the UK. When this happened, this capturing of the news cycle in the UK media, but in kind of platforms that have significant transnational impact, like the BBC, Indian media had to take notice. So let me just give you an example of what happened then in the Indian coverage. So hopefully you are now seeing this video. Yuki, can you confirm that now
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, I
okay.
do that.
Right, that's fine. So let me just play you this very short clip from NDTV so you can see that what happened then. Is
But the
the audio?
audio
The
is,
audio is not the audio is not
yeah.
audible. I'm sorry about that. So I think what basically because technology hampers us, but what is very interesting, again, you can I'll make the link available and all the links available through Yuki after this presentation. But what is very interesting is following that kind of coverage there, Indian media started questioning Indian politicians and saying, okay, if British MPs and British political actors are questioning Dow's participation in the Olympics, why aren't you taking a stand in this? So you get this very interesting intersection between national media systems, and you see how globalization allows for these kind of productive intersections. So actually then the Indian media took on this kind of nationalistic framing of, okay, the Indian politicians need to do something. And following this pressure from the Indian media, there was more statements. There was more political pressure that was uh, um, put forward by Indian political actors. But you can see the kind of strange circuit that had to be followed for that to happen. So that's an example of how the movement has been very effective in doing this. Okay, so summing up, while this presentation has been looking at the very creative hybrid mobilizations that a movement like Bhopal has been undertaking to ensure that its ideas, its stories, its frames, the themes that it wants to be covered in relation to the disaster get coverage in mainstream media, we see that this kind of thematic coverage is very difficult to sustain. So I've seen this in my research that there are these moments of opportunity, like the 2012 London Olympics, and we see these thematic ideas emerge, but they very quickly, from mainstream media, they disappear very quickly. The coverage tends to return to largely episodic nature. It largely tends to focus on national actors. So, in the beginning, I showed you that NDTV story. So it returns to that kind of very conventional news frame. Sometimes, we see party political frame. So it will say, okay, what did the BJP do, or what did the Congress do, and who is responsible? So we see that kind of party political framing returns. Also, not this kind of hybrid media work requires a lot of resources, a lot of training. It requires long-term planning. It requires support from media allies, and it is not possible for many movements. And finally, this kind of need for media literacy, for media capacities, means that if there are some people within the movement who have this kind of capacity, those people acquire greater power. So this can also create hierarchies within movements and can cause divisions within movements. So again, you can see that, while I've told you a story which is promising and highlights some of the potentials, we have to be also very, very aware of the challenges and the difficulties that still confront social movements as they try to negotiate this relationship. Okay, that's all that I had to say. Hopefully you have some questions, and I'd be very happy to answer these. There are references embedded here. I have mentioned to Yuki already that I'll make available the presentation as a PDF, so you can click on different links. All of my publications are available, off my profile, so you can, if you are interested, you can explore these. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pawas. It was really interesting to know how social movements and new media go hand in hand, and how systematically you have explained the movements being covered by television, what kind of, how they reword the things, as which is happening very recently, that in US, that it is a mob violence. So thank you very much for such even current informations linking it with Bhopal gas tragedy. Now I request all the participants, if you have any questions, you can ask them via chat window, or if you want to come on the screen and open up your mic and want to talk to Pawas, feel free to do that. So anyone, any questions?
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yeah, please tell your name and go ahead with the question.
Hello, sir. I'm Subhashini, and I wanted to ask that the Indian media is largely dominated by the political environment, so they do not cover stories like this. So, what is the way forward if any journalist wants to cover stories like this? How he should get motivated for this?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Subhashini. Thank you for that. You're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely on the mark to say that our media systems are dominated by political news, but political in the very narrow sense of focusing on parties. And unfortunately, this is true of many other media systems as well, globally. So it is difficult to disrupt this cycle. But having said that, the examples that I showed you are exactly instances where social movements are trying to break this cycle, and to insert their kind of thematic concerns into it. Also, there are, while I didn't mention this as part of my presentation, there are journalists who are able to build long-term relationships with social movements. So there are many journalists who have, over the course of about 35 years, consistently covered the Bhopal movement. There will always be newsworthy moments. So now this gas leak happened in Vizag. If you're a journalist who wants to talk about environmental safety, this is the perfect opportunity for you to get a big thematic piece out, because at the moment, any editor will accept it, because that's part of the current cycle. So, but to be able to do that in a way that is able to bring in the kind of appropriate context that is historically sensitive, is meeting some of the kind of needs of the social movements, you need some understanding. You need information, you need all of that. So it's the movement is trying to make this easier by creating resources like the ones I showed you on the website. But also, what is important is that they are trying to create relationships with journalists. So if you, as a young journalist, want to do this kind of work, I would say get in touch with social movements. Get to know their work, build those relationships. You're absolutely right. Maybe the majority of your work will still be the party political stuff, but there will be opportunities like this where you will be able to tell these stories, or you'll be able to find creative ways of telling these stories. So yeah, that's an imperfect answer.
Thank you, sir, for answering it. And one more thing, that basically channels focus on TRP. So
Yeah,
stories like these do not get the TRP. So how to deal with that?
yeah. I mean, the thing is that it's not. You are right that there are these kind of assumptions about what the public wants. But I think, to be honest, I think this is a false idea that the public does not want to hear about stories like the ones in Bhopal, or about movements happening. If you think about it, these are people's movements. These are issues that are affecting real people. So the forest rights movements, the Dalit movement, these are not small populations. These are populations, huge populations. Of course, they want to read about it. The problem sometimes is that journalism is dominated by maybe people like us, middle class, we are sometimes very far away. We have our own assumptions about what the people want. So sometimes this idea that this is not, I think it's a false idea. And as a journalist, you should try and question it when people say, okay, this will not be relevant, and you should say, okay, why would this not be relevant?
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Hi, ma'am. Preksha here.
Oh, sorry.
Yes,
Preksha, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Priksha.
Okay. Hi, sir. This is Preksha here. I'm a final year student of journalism at IIT. I firstly just want to thank you for your time and for the wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you something on lines of what Subhashini asked and your talk. It's like we realize that media coverage is not right at the moment. It's politicized, and there are a lot of things happening out there that need more coverage other than politics. But we as audience realize it, and as you mentioned that this narrative that the audience does not want to read this is not right. So why do you think that the media is not realizing it? Well, I don't think they don't realize it, but why are they shying away from covering stories that matter? There is one fact that they have investments from these big corporations, but do you think that is the only reason that is making them shy away from doing so?
I think, it's a complex set of reasons. You're absolutely right about there being corporate interests. We absolutely, that idea that a lot of our mainstream television media is owned by very narrow set of corporate interests. That is absolutely true, and that does mean that editorial decisions are made about not covering stories that would directly challenge the interests of these people. So that's a big reason. And I think more broadly, what we need is sometimes a way of because sometimes these stories are also seen as kind of threatening, that they say, okay, this story is too unfamiliar. Who are these people? We don't know these people. They're Adivasis, they're indigenous. How do they? So there is a kind of storytelling gap as well. So I think you're absolutely right. It's a combination of ownership, interest. It's the fact that a lot of journalists are part of an elite urban middle class that actually believes and shares in the values of neoliberal capitalism. So they actually might think that a lot of these movements are simply anti-development. So they feel that actually these ideas should not be supported. But also they often don't understand the stories. They often don't really know who these people are. What is the story? They don't understand the story. So if they don't understand what the story is, whose story it is, why it's important, they would not be able to even imagine what is possible. So this is a limitation. Of course, the speed of news production is also another problem. To understand a complex story, you need a little bit of time to create those relationships, to have that historical understanding. Contemporary journalism is not affording journalists that kind of time. They're not encouraged to do that. So that too is contributing to it. But that doesn't, you as a young journalist, I would say, this still does not mean that you can't do this kind of journalism. You can do this kind of journalism, but it does mean that you will have to make a real effort to create those relationships with the social movements, to get that kind of understanding, to capture those stories. And then I'm sure you can tell stories that will be powerful. We see actually that the kind of, in India and internationally, there are news platforms that do carry those thematic stories, but the percentage is very small. But you can be a part of making that bigger.
I
Thank you, sir.
understand the
Thank you.
concerns of students who are soon to be a journalist, that if they want to do such good work, that's not how and where they'll get the platform. But I must say here that new media is one field
Yes.
which allows you to convey whatever you want to. And this is a new platform for social movements. And you all have been big activists during so many things happening in Delhi recently. Uh, so I'm sure you don't need
Ma'am,
to rely on these news channels.
can I just make a comment or maybe an observation if you
Sure,
like?
Imran. Imran is also a faculty member in the department.
Thank you, Pawas, for this lucid and wonderful presentation. Actually, my question is a little bit not a question, but maybe an observation that we can add to later.
Absolutely.
Is it the time? Talking specifically in the context of research, is it the time that we move beyond framing research? Because the preposition of this question is that, see, uh, when you do a frame analysis of a particular story, for instance, all right, so what we tend to understand by framing research is that how a particular story has been framed. So the
Yes.
framing essentially is a very, it's a very voluntary kind of a very conscious way of doing something. To frame means to consciously frame something, right? But as you responded to Preksha's query on, when you actually demarcated, various
Yeah.
complex processes involving journalism,
Yeah.
the profession of journalism.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
would like to really understand how does the conceptual frameworks within the frame research, within the larger frame research, make us actually understand all those all those complexities surrounding the process of
Yeah.
journalism.
Yeah.
because
I think.
because yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very relevant question. I was, here what I was trying to demonstrate, because I focus specifically on what the social movements are trying to do. On the part of the social movements, there is a very deliberate attempt to reframe, to introduce a frame. So absolutely, that's absolutely conscious. It's an activist intervention. Now, you're absolutely right that on the part of the journalist, framing is not always a conscious process. And that is acknowledged in the framing literature. That frames can sometimes be very, very conscious and deliberate, but at other times these are, because if you look at the kind of sociological literature around frames are just basic ways of making sense of things, so we all comprehend reality in certain ways. So you're absolutely right. So the kind of more if you adopt the kind of framing approach to studying journalism, you can use it to identify what are the kinds of frames that are being used, but then absolutely, as you said, for the research to be meaningful, it would be very limited to think that these are simply somehow consciously being inserted on the basis of some agenda. No, these are part of larger ideological structures.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. We need therefore research that would be more multidimensional, that would look at political economy, that would look at sort of discourse, that would place. We need ethnography.
Ethnographies of newsroom ethnographies.
Yes, absolutely. I would encourage newsroom ethnography. We have very little of this kind of because it's hard. It's hard to do this work. So people don't do it. But you're absolutely right. I would hope maybe some students are also interested in going into journalism research. I think I would, or of course in your own research practice, I think it would be valuable to have ethnographic accounts of journalism practice.
Absolutely, and largely triangulating various methods all together and getting. One more thing I wanted to ask you about is you talked about journalists building a relationship with social movements, for instance. So it appears to me as a problem of it's a problem of the field, sharing of a field with somebody else. All right. So when journalism is a separate field of power, away from the literary, political, and economic fields. All right. So because obviously journalism as an independent, as a distinct field will never ever lean on to any other fields, right? And of course, as we have been, we have read that how did this distinction actually take place in the early 21st century in North America? So to what extent does a person lean on to some social movement? Because as I see it from certain cases like Chhattisgarh, Northeast, and Kashmir, if you tend to sort of lean towards certain social movement, if you sort of try to show some kind of an commitment towards some social movement, so at what point of time would other people in the other fields stop you from doing what you're particularly
Yes, I think you're absolutely. It's a very good question. It's a very good question. Because often these kind of relationships can also be used to delegitimize your status as a journalist. We're seeing in the country, actually, the government is actively, targeting people, who are being linked to movements on the left. So, I mean, is this right? I mean, I think it's very unfortunate that we are at the moment living in supposedly democratic systems where journalists who are wanting to engage with these issues, are wanting to have these kind of long-term relationships, are being seen as suspects, are being actively intimidated from developing these kinds of relationships. I think that's really, really unfortunate. So it should not be happening in a democratic society. It should not be happening. Unfortunately, we are in that situation. In this context, what should the response of journalists be? I think, it's hard for me as somebody who is does not have a stake in this in a kind of real way. I'm not a journalist to kind of say, okay, do it anyway. But I think it's really important that you find ways of doing it. In the end, if you're doing your job as a journalist and you are maintaining the professional values of your discipline, you should be able to stand your ground, and your organization should be able to stand their ground. Of course, it means that we need other institutions to be working, like the judiciary and all of that. So hopefully, the idea is that that still will persist, those freedoms persist in some way if we if we get pessimistic, then I think there is no.
But I'm a little unconvinced by this kind of a utopic,
Yeah. I mean, it's not. I think if we see that it's not utopic, because there are journalists who are doing these kinds of stories. So if I showed you some examples that are already there. Okay, there are platforms in India, but of course there are also internationally. So I can tell you the names of journalists. So Rama Lakshmi from the Washington Post is somebody who has been working consistently on the Bhopal issue. So she has been reporting constantly. Yes, there are various, if you're a journalist for an international organization, if you're based elsewhere, you have greater freedoms, maybe less fear. True. But there are, journalists, and I showed you a news click story where they are covering. So it's not as if you tell the story, people will immediately, you can tell these stories. There is a scope for. So I think we also self-censor, and we're saying, okay, this is not relevant, this is not going to sell, and all.
Correct,
so I think there are. It's not so kind of black and white.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. May I translate a question to you, because there is in chat window somebody has asked. I have a question. How do you think those who do not have access to new media will reach to the masses, since their voices do not reach the mainstream media?
Yes. Sorry. So this is about they don't have access to new media.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so this is absolutely a key problem. I don't have a simple answer to this, and that's why on that last slide, when I was talking about challenges, this is a key issue for us to be reflecting on. If we are saying that we are within a kind of hybrid media system, and new media allows you a pathway to getting attention of the mainstream media, what if you do not have? You need skills and capacities and resources to engage with new media technologies. And we are seeing this problem, so in the case of Bhopal, they're very lucky to have the support of some middle-class activists who have been embedded within the movement from its very inception. So they've had these capacities, they've built those skills over time. But you need really that kind of, skill, long-term development, also money, of course, to be exercising that kind of power. Similar, gaps have been pointed out in movements in the US as well. So some of the kind of movements with migrants, so there are. What happens then is that some people in the movement who have these capacities become the kind of dominant voice, and one might say, okay, the people who are actually the real participants then feel excluded from some of this process. So absolutely, there are. We really need, and social movements are actually acutely aware of this. So a movement like Bhopal is trying to build the capacities of its constituents. So they're actively doing media training for their, for the survivors there. So they've trained younger people in media skills. How to talk to the media, how to frame press releases, taking pictures. They became key intermediaries. So they're also doing this kind of training within the movement. And I think that's the answer, really, that movements have to start thinking about this. And if we are supporters of movements, like some of you are, maybe that's the work that you can do. You're a journalist student. You probably are highly trained in this. Can you do some skill sharing? Can you do some training for movements, who are lacking these? I think this is absolutely vital that we do this work.
We have time for one more question. This is Preksha again.
Preksha, we have a question prior to you asking.
Okay, I'll wait.
Some Preeti Yadav is asking, sir, whenever we see any piece of news anywhere within no span of time, all political parties start blaming each other, even though viewers to join the same blame game. This creates an atmosphere to stifle the reality of news. So is there any way to serve such news in a way that it not only stifles the information, but also makes the people understand the gravity of the information that's behind the blame games?
Very good question. That's a really fine question. This is, again, I don't have an easy answer because. So I did not. I showed you the Olympics example. So again, what is happening very quickly with a story like that is, okay, the corporation enters the narrative. We are suddenly, mainstream media is talking about Dow's responsibility. The company is responsible. Something should be done. Justice needs to be done. Very quickly, it becomes a case of the opposition suddenly saying, okay, why are these people not who are in power not doing anything about it? If we were in power, we would do something. But Bhopal has been 35 years. Every party, two parties, cycling in and out of power, have been in power, have been out of power, have not done anything. So it's really, if it were not so serious, it would be funny. Dow has employed as its lawyer. So these are people who've been employed as their lawyers. Abhishek Manu Singhvi was a congressperson, and then, oh, I'm forgetting his name. A key BJP minister who was also a lawyer was employed by Dow, and they both produced actually long, analysis of why Dow is not responsible. So this is what the corporation is doing. So it happens behind the scenes. Of course, they don't talk about it. That they have two really, really important politicians who also happen to be lawyers on their payroll. So we see that this is, unfortunately, we have a media system that is immediately, because it's focusing on political actors, speaks to them, and they immediately start framing it as a party political issue. On the other hand, we have these kind of secret alliances between corporations and politicians, hidden. They're not secret, but they're hidden, which also ensures that they don't talk about the real issues when they are asked about these things. So there's no simple answer about how to disrupt this. I think it's a question of how do you recapture the story. It's a struggle. I think from research, I feel that it's a bit difficult for social movements, to do that. But again, if you are the journalist, you are the stakeholders, you can try to, make sure that you can disrupt this. I think, yeah. So we need some shift in also, what journalists are doing. Journalists, as a journalist, if you're playing the same game, yeah. So maybe it's also about journalism training.
Yeah, sure. Preksha, you can ask.
Yes, sir. So I just wanted to ask you on the lines of you mentioning that we as students should volunteer for these social movements and try to help them, maybe share our own skills. So, we many of us are involved with such social movements at the moment, and now that we're going to go to the practicing sphere of the profession, we'll take these forward with us. So, to what extent can we help them as professionals that it does not account as a conflict of interest on our part? That we don't favor them, but at the same time we're there for them.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think different journalists have negotiated this in different ways. So I was giving you the example of Rama Lakshmi. She works for the Washington Post. So I would also encourage you to look at her stories. She is somebody who has been working with the Bhopal movement for a long time. I think the way she handles this conflict of interest issue is that if she's writing a story and she tells a story that includes the perspective of the movement or highlights the issues that the movement wants to highlight, I think that's perfectly fine, because that's just your perspective as a journalist, that you are highlighting certain issues. There's no conflict of interest there. However, when she did some kind of direct helping, so she helped the movement in building a museum for the movement locally. When she was doing that project, she actually stepped away from her role at the Post for, I think, a period of maybe a year or 6 months. She actually stopped writing stories during that period, and she just focused on that. So I think, yeah, so that's how she kind of balanced it, that in that period she did not she kind of stepped away from a journalist role so that she could actually say that she was not in a sense mixing her professional responsibilities. Yeah, I mean, I think ethics in journalism is these have to be negotiated in practice. These are not black and white. I think, my point about journalistic values, if in your work as a journalist, you're adhering to journalistic values, you're fine. If you're not doing that, then then there's a problem. If you write a story that's poorly researched, simply reproducing something that you're hearing from the movement, then of course that's suspect from a professional standpoint. So I think, yeah, it's hopefully that gives you some sense of how this question may be answered. But I would say that don't see this as being sort of fundamentally opposed, that these are kind of fields that are separated. We need people who are straddling fields really to make sure that we get different kinds of stories.
Thanks a lot, sir. This has been on my mind since very long, and I think I got an answer. Thank you.
Okay. UK, we can't hear you.
Yuki, ma'am, you are inaudible.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Yes. Now we can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Perfect. I was just saying that these questions will continue because all of them have so many questions to ask you. Maybe I can request them to email it to me,
Sure.
and I can forward it to you. I
Sure.
understand you have time constraints.
Yes.
We can maybe call it a day for a moment. This is just momentary. And whenever you get a chance to come to India, I would like to personally invite you for a lecture at our university.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I would be, thank you, to everyone who is on the call, to the students who asked the questions, of course, to Yuki and to Imran for giving me this opportunity. I must say, I really enjoyed speaking to you. And I'm also really encouraged by the fact that so many of the students are thinking about these issues, are wanting to occupy this space between journalism and activism. And I would really encourage you to do it. I think it's so important that you do so. So I'm really happy on that count. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you to all
you.
the participants.
Thank you. Bye.